I moved it closer so we can actually see if it runs out of time this time. Welcome back, everybody, to Friday Questions. I am Luke.
I am Mark.
And this week we talked about, Mark talked about Daniel chapter 4. Give us a summary.
So in Daniel 4, we jump ahead 20 to 30 years from the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story. And Nebuchadnezzar actually wrote this chapter, as we talked about this last weekend. And in it, he describes a dream that he has about a huge, massive tree that gets chopped down by an angel, most likely. But then it discusses a man who, instead of acting like a man, becomes like a beast and wanders around for a period of 7 somethings. Most people assume 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
He
and
asks
some data to back up that claim.
There is, yes. Then, of course, Daniel's the only one who can interpret the dream. Daniel states the dream is about you, Nebuchadnezzar. The chapter then jumps ahead 1 year. Nebuchadnezzar is walking around his palace, and he is spouting out how great he is and how much he has done to enable all of this. And God makes good on what he had claimed in the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar basically becomes a beast.
Mm-hmm.
And for 7 years, probably, he lives in obscurity as a beast. The key verse that we really focused on this last weekend was after those 7 years were over, Nebuchadnezzar wrote this in verse 34, "At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven." That was really the key phrase.
Mm-hmm.
"And my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High." And the chapter concludes with Nebuchadnezzar being placed back into his position as ruler of the Babylonian Empire. And this is the last time we see Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. And so we wondered if maybe this closes with him having made a complete movement towards God, not just seeing God in action in previous chapters, if maybe his heart was actually changed.
Yeah.
So clearly a lot of conversation about pride and humility and how pride festers and grows in our lives and how we can choose the way of Jesus and have authentic humility like Nebuchadnezzar chose before God in this chapter.
And so first, what kind of, you were telling me something about some historical data that kind of backs up that 7-year claim. What was that?
There is no historical information on Nebuchadnezzar for a 7-year period of time. And these emperors and rulers tend to write and dictate things about themselves quite often. So historians and archaeologists have a 7-year gap where they can't find nothing in physical form that would describe Nebuchadnezzar's rule, reign, or events in Babylon. And we found that pretty intriguing, that if he was a beast for 7 years and there's 7 years of missing data on him, it's always great when historians and archaeologists finally catch up to the Bible. When after time they finally figured it out that this is what actually happened.
So, it's funny, the progression of Nebuchadnezzar. He sees this stuff. He kind of goes back to what he did before. He sees, because in each instance that he saw something, he makes a statement about God being above all. 3 times that happens, he makes a statement about something, God is above all, and yet here he is again, I did all of this. And I've been reading through Ezekiel right now, and Ezekiel is a contemporary of Daniel, lives in the same time period, and Ezekiel is prophesying to Israel after they've been taken captive, at least once, and the prophecies are far harsher in Ezekiel than they were prior. And it's funny because you see initially God takes the people into the promised land. He says, I'm going to, your enemies are going to fall before you, and I'm going to make peace for you, and I'm going to do all this stuff for you, and then you'll know that I'm God. And as the prophets go on, Israel doesn't really believe, and God says, look, I'm going to do this, and then you're going to know that I'm God. And finally he gets to the point where in Ezekiel where he's like, look, bad stuff is going to happen. I tried to show you I was God this way. You still, so we're going to take it a step up here, and you will know that I am in control. And that's kind of the same progression that Nebuchadnezzar has. He saw it, he kind of believed, he went back. He saw it, he kind of believed, he went back. And finally God says, look, I'm going to show you once and for all. Because in the dream, it doesn't promise that he will come back. It says there's a chance that he will come back, right? There's a sprout.
Right. And then the fact that the angel wraps a band around the tree trunk after the tree is chopped down, the band around the tree trunk of iron and bronze, I believe, may be some kind of a symbol that we're going to protect this so that there could be future growth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is the hint. And again, nothing for sure, but that's the hint that maybe there will be restoration. And then we find out at the end of the chapter that that's what indeed happened.
Yeah. And so you wonder if Nebuchadnezzar ended that 7 years and didn't look up to heaven and say, God is above all, would he have come back? You know,
it's a great what if in Daniel 4.
Yeah. So anyway, let's get to our questions. Our first question being, does humble mean I have to let people walk all over me?
Mm-hmm.
So the name of the teaching this week was Be Humble. And so, you know, people have this idea of what humbleness means, and then you have verses about, you know, if somebody strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. And if somebody takes, what is it? Somebody takes your cloak, offer them
your second one
as well. And so it, you know, some people would take that to mean like, oh, I just have to let people do whatever they want to me, and probably not the most happiest of lives.
That's a great reason why someone would say, I'm not going to choose humility then.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be a doormat. I don't want to be abused. I don't want to be verbally, physically, emotionally abused. I don't want to be a doormat. I don't want to be in a toxic relationship, which none of us would be. And so, how do we understand humility as we saw in Daniel 4 and even Paul's description of Jesus' humility in Philippians 2?
Yeah.
How do we take that and then also think through our relationships and when the fear that we might get walked on?
Yeah.
And that is an amazing question. That's a great way to extend what we were discussing this weekend. And one thing that we talked about was that humility must also be paired with honesty.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's never loving, it's never showing the way of Jesus if you allow someone to sin against you or to sin in the way they treat another person. To allow someone to have that kind of negative influence over you is not something that is prescribed in Scripture. It's not in Jesus and the way he interacted with the religious leaders, which would probably be the ones that were looking to push their agenda upon him. You'll notice that he didn't back down.
Right.
He spoke very clearly and directly to them.
Yeah.
And so we thought that perhaps a way to think through this is if humility is taking on the form of a servant the way Jesus did, and so you are attempting to raise people up and give to them your best. We even use the apron of humility. If you're giving someone your best to help them through life, one of the ways you can do that is to speak truthfully to someone about how they're interacting with you.
Yeah.
And that to create distance for yourself from someone who is influencing you in a negative way is actually a movement of love.
Yeah. And I suppose you could take that too far. I once heard somebody say the most loving thing you could do for somebody is to point out their sin. It's like, well, that's like step one. The most loving thing you can do, you want to point it out, but you don't just leave it there. You don't just leave it at like, hey, let me tell you what a bad person you are.
Right, yeah.
I mean, that's
sounds like sin police again.
Yeah,
like, let me explain all your flaws to you and then walk away.
Yeah, that's not the gospel. The gospel is show the sin, but then show the mercy and the grace that covers the sin, and that's what brings about the change. And that's kind of what you're saying is if you yeah, I mean, if I'm a Christian and somebody is treating me badly, I'm not being loving to them by letting them continue to treat me badly. I'm letting them continue in their sin. That's not loving for somebody, So how would you go about it then?
So you think through even 1 Corinthians 13, which people often call the love chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Think through what the different ways that Paul describes what love looks like. And by the way, this chapter isn't just to be used at a wedding ceremony. This was a within the house churches in Corinth. This is everyone, how you love one another. Think through those statements and infusing those statements in your life and trying to influence someone to have those same statements of love in their approach to you is perhaps the honest way to try to influence someone in a way so that your relationship can be rectified.
Yeah.
And there can be reconciliation.
Yeah.
And there can be redemption, perhaps. It does not mean that all I do is humbly allow a person to say and do whatever they want to me, but instead have the boldness and the honesty to say, here is where this relationship is not strong. Here is where you perhaps are stepping into a situation that is negative towards me. How can we resolve this? How can we redeem our relationship? And then I also think of Paul in a couple places towards the end of Romans when he's giving some very practical wisdom to the Romans house churches on two occasions. Romans 12, verse 18, and Romans 14, 19. He talks about, as much as it depends upon you, be at peace with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that Paul said that as much as it depends upon you. So there are situations where you can humbly approach and truthfully approach a person.
Mm-hmm.
And yet if there is not the possibility for reconciliation, then you've done all you can do, and you should probably give yourself distance from that other person.
What does it say? It only takes one for forgiveness, but it takes two for reconciliation.
Correct, yes.
I can forgive you, and I can not hold that sin against you, but I can't force reconciliation. You can't force somebody to behave the correct way. And so, so this idea of communication, like we think, oh no, I don't want to cause a problem. I can't say anything.
Mm-hmm.
But what's like one of the first things that they tell you to do in marriage counseling? It's always like communicate. You have to communicate. When the marriage falls apart, it's when there's a lack of communication. It's usually when one person says, oh, I don't want to say anything. Mm-hmm. One person is guns blazing and the other person is like, well, I'm not going to say anything. And then this lack of communication is where the relationships break down. It goes to any other relationship you have. We talked last week about how Daniel handled several of the situations that he was in. Mm-hmm. And we said how he dealt with those in a humble way. He didn't demand, he didn't scream, he didn't yell, but he also didn't ignore it. He didn't just say, well, I guess we're going to die. That's all I can do. He approached the situation. He looked for a resolution. He just did it in a humble way. So I think we can clearly say that, does being humble mean to let people walk all over me? No, it doesn't. No. Any other thoughts on that?
Just one last thing. We often speak in Scripture. We see a lot of balance of grace and truth. Mm-hmm. Jesus was full of grace and truth. Yeah. That is essentially what's happening here. If you think of the gracious side of this equation as the humility that we're trying to show, the truth would be the honesty and the truthfulness that we're trying to bring to a relationship that needs some work. Yeah. And so just as we see a balance of grace and truth in Jesus and how we should approach life, same thing here. If you have just humility and not the truthfulness and the honesty that comes with it, then the equation is missing. Yeah.
It's always isn't that how everything in Christianity is? It's always a balance.
There is a balance.
And in every aspect, you can always take it too far this way or too far this way, and the answer is always somewhere in the middle.
The extremes are rarely correct. The truth is in the tension-filled middle. Yeah. This is harder to live this way, but it's more accurate to what Jesus wants us to do.
It is. It's tension-filled sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, I need to do something about this. I need to say something about this. I want to say it in a loving way. I can't let this just go, but I also don't want to cause problems. And it's like trying to thread that needle of dealing with a situation, but doing it in a humble way. And I guess the humbleness also, we can be humble because we know that God is behind us.
Mm-hmm.
I think somebody who's not humble, what would you say the opposite of humbleness would be?
Well, it's someone who's prideful, arrogant, doing
arrogant.
things for themselves, very self-focused. We talked about that, self-centered.
And that attitude, what does it come from? There's God isn't, there's not this thought of God is with me and he's going to take care of stuff in there. So it's very much well, I have to compensate for it. And so we can be humble because God is with us. We're not in this alone. I don't have to fix everything myself. I don't have to have all the wisdom in the world. God is with me. He will help me take care of it. So I guess if you're struggling with the humbleness, maybe make sure that like if you're struggling with a fear of saying something, make sure hey, God is with you. If you find yourself overcompensating for stuff, also make sure God is with you. You don't have to overcompensate. What Ray always says, you don't have to cower or tower. I don't have to fall back because I'm afraid. I don't have to tower over somebody to show whatever. And I thought you put it well too. Don't act big, don't act small. Act medium.
Yep. And having the Holy Spirit helps.
Yeah.
Pretty good, helpful.
So that kind of segues into our second question. And I believe this goes right along with humbleness. And I feel like this word it has a connotation to it in our modern times that is not in the original meaning. And that is meekness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Bible talks about being meek, and that I feel like goes right along with humbleness, because the same way people say, well, being humble means I have to just let people do whatever. Well, they might feel the same way. Well, being meek means I have to not stand up for myself, or I have to not say anything, or I have to not do anything. So to an extent, we've already answered this, but let's talk about it anyway.
Sure. Isn't it kind of common that a lot of people would associate meekness with weakness?
Mm-hmm.
Like just take the M and flip it upside down. They're the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Even though Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And I think we've kind of landed on the idea that humility and meekness have some overlap, but there's also some difference to them.
Yeah.
I think the most powerful way I ever heard meekness defined was when a pastor once described it to me as controlled strength.
Mm-hmm.
Controlled strength or controlled influence, where and the vision he gave was think of a bodybuilder or some guy that's just completely ripped. So think of the opposite of me. Think of someone who actually is big and strong and powerful, and they're holding a newborn child. And that controlled strength and controlled influence is really where meekness lands. Moses was discussed many times in the early books of the Old Testament as being a very meek individual. So you think of the authority and the influence and the power that Moses had, and yet the restraint that he used, especially when the Israelites were driving him crazy. And God in a couple times said, I'm just going to wipe them out and start all over with you, Moses. And he
God even says, there was nobody like my servant Moses that I talked to face like that. And so that, like you said, that amount of power that he walked around with and yet didn't feel the need to
exercise it in a negative way.
Yeah.
Yes. And so if you think of meekness as the way in which you control the power and the strength and the authority that you have, then it's somewhat distinct from humility then, because humility is more of a servant's approach to things. How am I going to serve you? How am I going to come alongside you and do for you and humbly serve you the way Jesus humbly served us? Meekness has more of you have actually maybe authority, power, control. You have strength, and you restrain it because you know that in those instances, the restraint is necessary to accomplish something or to give a person the chance to grow and mature and work through something.
And I guess it kind of goes back to the same reason you can be that way, because I know that God's with me. I know that I don't have to control the situation. I know I don't have to completely give up control either, because I know that God's with me in it. And so I always remember one time when Nathan was really little, toddler, and we were flying somewhere, and I don't remember how it started. I just remember that Nathan was moving the chair, or he was doing something, and the guy whose chair it was, he might have said something, and I think Amanda was like, "Oh, like what happened?" Like we didn't realize something was happening. And I don't remember exactly what was said, but I remember he turned around and he said, "Oh no, I love having a little kid like kick my chair or something." I don't think Nathan was kicking the chair, but he was doing something. And he got up and stormed off. And I always remember Amanda's response to that. She went to him and she said, "I'm so sorry that he was doing that. I didn't realize that he was doing that. We wouldn't have let him done that if we did that." A lot of people would be like, "Don't you talk to my kid that,
Right.
don't you this oversized reaction." So a meekness and a humbleness comes from being able to say, "Hey, maybe I had some fault in this. I'm not perfect." It's understanding that I've been forgiven. I can forgive. I've done wrong. You've done wrong. It's having this "I'm not better than you" attitude, so that when something like that happens, we can go to say, "Hey, look, I'm sorry. I was wrong in this situation. Let's fix it." Or, it's not this demanding. It's not,
Yeah, there's a lot of self-control
yeah,
in meekness.
yeah,
And that's one of the fruit of the Spirit. So that's why we see it being infused into the biblical passages, because if that is something that is of the heart of God,
right,
and think of even the number of times we're even seeing it in Daniel 4, where the control that God has to endure Nebuchadnezzar's lack of acknowledging God,
yeah,
gives him a dream, whole year goes by, and yes, the outcome of the dream is reality, and yet God still offers restoration and a second chance at the end.
mm-hmm.
There's some meekness there to the control of that situation without things getting out of hand, without becoming overbearing or using your influence in a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
So that you can see then how meekness runs its way through many of the people that we see throughout Scripture. When they showed meekness, it was because they had a position of influence, authority, or they had the ability to perhaps take things in their own selfish way, and yet they showed controlled strength.
And we see that later on. The story of Daniel in the lion's den is a story of other people. So Daniel's in a place of authority, and there's other people in a place of authority, but they don't have the confidence that comes from God being in their life. So they're thinking, "Look, we got to get rid of Daniel." And so they do this end run around to try to take him out. And Daniel could be humble because, one, he knew God was with him, and so he's like, "Look, I don't have to watch my own back.
Yeah.
Not that I can just do whatever, but I know God's with me. I know God's going to take care of me. So when these other people try to do an end run around me, who ends up eaten by lions in that story?"
Boy, you're doing some major Daniel 6 spoilers here.
That's true. That's probably we got to save some for Daniel 6.
Right.
Yeah. So let's go to question 3 then.
Yeah,
Let's go to question 3. So question 3, we see things like this in the Bible, and some people might have the question of, well, when bad things happen in my life, is that God punishing me?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I thought we'd break this question down a little bit. First, let's ask the question, because I think even somebody who might believe that probably doesn't believe every single time something bad happens to me, it was God.
I would
right?
hope not. That
I
almost
tripped over something. Oh, God was punishing me.
that almost becomes like someone who believes in fate
Right.
and chance,
Yeah.
and even like a very somewhat primitive belief in God that
Mm-hmm.
it's not raining because we've offended him,
Yeah.
or if a natural disaster occurs because we've hurt our God. I would hope that, and if you do feel that way, recognize that that's not really how God portrays himself throughout Scripture or in our lives.
Yeah. So assuming somebody doesn't believe that, first I thought, let's answer the question, why are the various reasons that bad things do happen?
Mm-hmm.
So even if you think, oh, well, God's punishing me, obviously everything you probably don't think God's punishing you. So what other reasons would bad stuff happen?
Well, I think first and foremost, we live in a sinful, fallen, broken world,
Mm-hmm.
and I use the phrase the shrapnel of sin will
Mm-hmm.
sometimes hit us. So that
Yeah.
there are occasions where just living in a world where sin exists means that there will be quote unquote bad things that happen, and it may not even be anything that we brought upon ourselves. It may not be something that we have wandered away from truth, and so therefore maybe God's trying to get our attention or anything of that nature. Sometimes just things happen because it's a reminder that where we're living right now is not where we were designed to live.
Yeah.
And where we will, if we're Jesus followers, not live for eternity.
Yeah.
There's a better world waiting for us where those things won't happen.
Yeah.
But then there are times when the things that happen in our lives that are negative are a result of our own decisions, our own choices,
Yeah.
and our own thinking, and we've brought it upon ourselves. And you could say that about Nebuchadnezzar. He's brought this upon himself
Yeah.
in his approach to God. And then in some cases, there may be things that are happening because there is this need maybe to regain your attention or to help you see the error of your ways and give you a chance to learn from an adjustment in your circumstances, that maybe this will wake you up.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like Nebuchadnezzar, you will lift your eyes up and you will recognize that this is a thing that has happened that will perhaps repoint me and redirect me on the right path again.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me break a few of those down. Let's if we categorize them,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes bad things happen because people make bad choices. We are given free will. We do dumb stuff.
We do.
We do dumb stuff, and let me save that one. People do bad stuff. Somebody runs a red light. There's a car accident. Somebody steals. Somebody, I don't know, gets drunk and drives. There's a lot of bad choices that people can make that will affect us negatively, and we don't really have any control over that. So people make bad choices. Reason one. Two, sometimes things just happen. There is a cause and effect. There's an order to the world and to creation. It rains because water evaporated, and when there's too much moisture in the air, it falls back down. And the wind carries that along, and, sometimes it just rains on you. The Bible says the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. So sometimes stuff just happens because it just happens.
Mm-hmm.
Third, from what I'm hearing you say, is, there's this quote attributed to John Wayne on the internet, and surely the internet's always right. So I'll just assume
I've never
this
found
is
it to be
true.
wrong.
No. It says, life is hard. It's harder when you're stupid. Sometimes our own bad choices bring bad stuff on ourselves. And I've always found when I don't take care of a problem, by the time I'm forced to take care of that problem, it is way worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so what have we got? Sin causes people to make bad choices. Cause and effect, sometimes stuff just happens. Sometimes our own choices cause bad stuff to happen. So that's three. So none of those involve God. So the fourth thing you said was, and I would phrase this as, sometimes God allows things in our life to bring correction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a difference. There's a difference between I did something wrong, God is mad at me, and now I'm facing the consequences, versus I'm heading in a bad direction and God is trying to correct my course. And I would I would say that's the more likely. I mean, how many times did that happen to the Israelites in the Old Testament? You guys are going off. He gives them, first he gives them a warning. Hey, you guys are heading the wrong direction here. You're heading the wrong direction here. And the worst, honestly, is Romans, when it says he gave them over to their desires. He's bringing correction because the alternative to not bringing correction is far worse. So I wouldn't call it when there's situations where God is directly involved like that, I wouldn't characterize it as punishment. I mean, do you feel I'm on the right track with those?
I do. Once heard it said that God is a perfect gentleman. He never really forces himself upon anyone. And so when our choices or our decisions perhaps are walking us away and heading us down a very dangerous path, God will not force himself upon us, but he may allow some things, and usually they're the consequences of our choices. He'll let those play out so that we can get a very stark understanding that the path I've chosen is not a wise path. What you've just said that is so key to this, the reason why we wouldn't say it's punishment as much as it's correction is because God provides, as we said already today, restoration and redemption on the backside of that. Go back to Daniel 4. Nebuchadnezzar, once he comes to his senses, lifts his eyes up, realizes who God is. The rest of the chapter reminds us that he was then placed back into a position of authority.
Right.
So it corrected him.
Yeah.
And it may have corrected him for the rest of his earthly life, as far as we know. And so in that situation, it isn't God is so mad and angry that he is just going to rain holy wrath down upon Nebuchadnezzar. He gave him a warning. 12 months went by. That's incredibly gracious of God to put up with that for a year.
Yeah. And at the time, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't at the point of, I have done everything myself. This was a warning about where he was headed.
Yes.
It was only at the point where he went full on.
Right.
I am basically God.
Yes.
Then God said, okay, but prior to that, it was a warning that God gave him. Hey, this is the path you're headed down, and I'm going to bring correction there. And even again, and I go back to the Old Testament and the prophets, and we think like so much is like God saying, I'm coming to get you. I'm coming to, like, that's how people characterize it a lot of times. But when you actually read it, every one of those is followed by a restoration at the end. God's desire is always about restoration. It's always to bring us back to him, back to the perfect way that he created things. It's never about punishment for punishment's sake. It's never about, I'm going to get you. It's never about that. It's always to bring us back, to restore us to where we need to be.
What we seem to be guilty of here is we will often project bad parenting onto God.
Yes. Yeah.
So some of the worst parenting moves that have ever been made in the history of parenting that probably maybe we've made. I don't know. We're probably really great dads.
Yeah.
Down
the
deep
best.
inside.
The
Very
best.
humble about our daddishness. But bad parenting, we feel probably is how God parents or how God oversees things. And so the quicker we can readjust our thinking and not believe that the way poor human parenting and leadership means that's how God is going to parent and lead us. The quicker we can get away from this idea of, oh, God's mad at me, God's punishing me.
Yeah.
But instead it's like, God, what am I trying to learn from this? What are you wanting to teach me here? And it may just be teaching me, not that I need to correct something, or it may just be teaching me that, a good reminder that we live in a fallen world and we long for the day where we can be with you for eternity. And it's just a good reminder of that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this verse in James 1:14. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, and here's why God brings correction, because we are tempted by evil desire and we are tempted by sin. And it says here, God does not tempt anybody, and God is not tempted by evil. But it says we are tempted by evil, and the reason he brings correction is because verse 15, Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So anytime God is correcting us, it's to avoid where sin leads us, which is death, which is ultimate separation from God. And God's ultimate desire is for reconciliation. So
I think as we try to move in the direction of making our minds be like the minds of Jesus, and our hearts be like the heart of Jesus, and our actions be like the actions of Jesus, we gain some maturity in our Christian walk, hopefully, so that we don't automatically respond to any negative, sinful, bad things that happen. We don't respond in a kind of a juvenile way, like, well, he must be mad at me, or what did I do wrong?
Yeah.
But we have a more wholesome approach to it. And like we haven't mentioned him yet, but one of the greatest examples would be Job throughout and the way his approach to this. And he did challenge God a few things at the end, but the whole point of that narrative is to show us that things that really were not his fault happened to him, and yet his ability to trust God even when this had made no sense was what on the back end provided great redemption and restoration for him.
Yeah, and a lot of Old Testament scholars believe that Job is placed there as a way, as they wrestled with, well, why does bad stuff happen? They wrestled with it back then, and it was like this, well, why does bad stuff happen? We have all this stuff in Proverbs about, if you do this, if you do this, if you do this, good stuff. And then you have other times in the Psalms where it's like, why are my enemies rejoicing over me? Why is all this bad stuff happening to me? And, it's something that, if it makes you feel better, it's something that they wrestled with all the way back from the beginning. It's not something that you're the only one struggling with that. It's a common theme.
Nothing new under the sun.
Yeah. 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 So, any last thoughts? Did we answer that question?
I think so, because we kind of demonstrated that it's not a wise and mature response to negative things in life, immediately assuming that God is punishing you and God is mad at you. I think there's deeper reasons for it.
Yeah.
That have lessons and growth within them. Punishment often just, they're mad at me, and maybe in a few months or a few days or a few hours, they'll quit being mad at me and we'll get back to normal.
Yeah.
Where this is, there's something positive waiting for us on the other side, something good to approach this bad thing with, that I can have the wisdom to know what's on the other side of this is something that's going to help me a great deal.
I just thought of this. I don't want to get carried away again, but at the end of James, now listen, and I feel like this is to an extent where this idea comes from, or one of the places that it comes from. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money, while you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills it, we will live and do this and that. And so I think it's that idea taken to the extreme. If the Lord wills it, we'll do this or do that. And so, if bad stuff happened, the Lord must have willed that. Everything must be happen. I have no control over anything. God controls everything. And again, one extreme or the other. I have all the power. I have no power. That middle,
tension-filled middle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, all right. Well, as always, we appreciate the questions. If you have questions about this week's teaching, or it doesn't even have to be about the teaching directly, maybe it's something about something that's going on. If you have questions, send them in, questions@dbcc.com. I'm Luke.
I'm Mark.
And this has been Friday Questions.
See you next week.